How can we preserve nutritional goodness from farm to fork, given the urgent need to produce healthy, affordable, sustainable and culturally acceptable diets for all? This was the theme of the recent Nestlé International Nutrition Symposium held at Nestlé Research in Lausanne, Switzerland. More than 20 leading scientific lights from around the world came together to assess the current scientific evidence with a view to driving action. The pod that you're about to hear was recorded during the symposium, and the speakers refer to content from their presentations, which you can access in full via the YouTube link in the description. The views of our guest are his own. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Power Food Podcast, live from the NINS in Lausanne. We are very honored to have Professor Charles Godfray here with us. He just gave a fascinating keynote lecture on the challenges of providing healthy, sustainable and equitable diets for all. A very warm welcome, Charles, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be in Lausanne again.
Thank you. So, Charles, in your lecture, you discussed the challenges we're facing to provide such healthy, sustainable, and equitable diets. Could you summarize these for our audience and explain how they are interconnected?
The way I think about the challenges ahead is that there are 4 different components to it. We need to change our diets so that they're more healthy and they're more sustainable. We need to produce more food to meet the increasing demand that we'll see this century, probably 30 to 50% greater demand for food. And we need to produce that food in new ways that has less impact on the environment. We need to also look at food waste, how we can reduce food waste. And then we need to think about the governance of the food system. Not all countries can produce all the food they need. So we need to have a well-functioning, resilient global food system so that the countries that are net producers of food can provide food for those that are net consumers of food.
Well, that's really interesting. And taking the point that you raised on the impact of food production in terms of the climate change, what can we do to increase the agricultural production that is needed to feed the 10 billion, address the people's health on top of that, and reduce the impact on the planet at the end?
So there are several things that one can do. Obviously, there are parts on the consumer side. So by changing diets and moving towards diets that have got a smaller component of the foods that produce the most emissions, that will be very helpful. But even within the foods that you produce, there are a variety of different things that one can do to reduce the greenhouse gas effects of the food we produce. One is to be just more efficient in the way we use inputs at the moment. So a phrase you hear a lot is precision agriculture. Mm-hmm. And to give a concrete example, precision agriculture, when one uses fertilizer only when it is needed and only enough, that means it's good for the farmer saves money by not wasting fertilizer, and it's good for the environment. There's less runoff from agricultural lands into water bodies, and fertilizers, at least as the way we produce them now, require a lot of energy and produce a lot of emissions. And so by using inputs such as fertilizers in a more directed way, that can be very helpful. Just while I'm talking about fertilizers, and most fertilizers is produced by the Haber-Bosch process, which is over 100 years old, and probably has definitely has saved a huge amount of lives. But as I said, it's very greenhouse gas intensive. And it's almost because it is so cheap to produce fertilizer like that, there's been insufficient research into how one might produce fertilizers with less greenhouse gas emissions. So I think this is the part of the refocusing of agricultural research. Yes, we do need to continue to think about increasing yields, but it does need to be this double focus, both on yields and on sustainable yields.
Okay, very interesting but very clear as well. So how positive do you feel that we will take the urgent actions needed to truly turn things around? It sounds like we need to rethink food systems and maybe also take up things, as you said, we have sometimes methods that are dating 100 years, so we may need to rethink. You were mentioning new methods as well, and Yeah, and considering probably also that this requires a multi-stakeholder effort from farmers, governments, industry, NGOs, and ultimately consumers all pulling together, how positive are you?
So let me answer that question by saying how positive I am in the long term, the medium term, and the short term. In the long term, I really am quite positive. My disciplinary background is population biology. I think one of the most extraordinary things that's happened in my adult intellectual life the last 30 years is that we know that if you bring people out of poverty, if you educate their children, especially their girls, and if you provide access to reproductive health care, natural fertility goes down. So we can now anticipate a time when global populations will cease to rise. And we can anticipate a time when the impact on the globe will cease to increase. And to me, that's hugely exciting, and that makes me optimistic. So I'm optimistic in the long term. In the medium term, next couple of decades, I don't know. If you look at what has happened this year in around the world with extreme events, people have, I think, really begun to experience as part of their lived experience what climate change is. We've seen this in Europe with very bad droughts, and we've seen it in the extraordinary heat wave earlier this year in India. And as we speak now, I think about a third of Pakistan is underwater. So I hope that this is going to lead to new activity and new energy on the political front. With climate change, I don't know whether the UN process is going to be the process that is going to solve that. I have held out hopes that the European community, working with the Chinese, working with the United States, the three big regulatory blocs in the world, including one that the UK is sadly no longer part of, that they might be able to provide a coalition of the willing. I'm talking about the environment. I think we also need to think about the increasing realization about the bad health consequences of the diets we eat. I think we will be increasingly impossible to ignore the epidemic of chronic illnesses that's caused. So I don't know, but I'm hopeful that there will get more political energy of that in the next couple of decades. When it comes to the short term, I am not very optimistic. I think we are living through a period of unparalleled geopolitical turmoil that is going to get in the way of policy making in the food system, as well as directly affecting policy making. In my own country today, food price inflation is the highest it's been since 1970s. So I think we're going to have a very tough couple of years. So I'm a bit pessimistic in the short term. I'm not sure about the medium term, and I'm optimistic in the long term. Excellent.
Well, that's interesting. I hope that this can turn around to more optimism for the near future as well. Considering the complexity, could you just elaborate a little bit more? You mentioned governments, the UN agencies. Who else plays a role? And then also maybe, as we are here in Nestlé Research, I mean, what do you see as a role also for private sector?
So the private sector is critical in the food system. I get a bit frustrated sometimes by people who think of the private food sector almost in the same breath as tobacco. Now, if the tobacco industry disappeared tomorrow, that would be positive for the world. The global food industry has provided affordable food for a huge number of people very efficiently. So I think there's some very positive parts about that. Having said that, there is a lot that could be done better by the private sector. I think it's an interesting question about how much one should expect the private sector to reform itself and how much one should expect governments to set the regulatory framework in which the private sector operates. I think my view is that the governments should be more active in setting that. They should set a level playing field, and that they should put rules in place for a sufficient period of time that the private sector can justify investment. What irritates most of my private sector friends is when a rule comes in and then is changed a year later. And we've seen that quite a bit in my country. I think that the leading firms in the private sector are often on the front foot arguing for intelligent rules and intelligent regulations. I think the components of the private sector that are not leading resist any change as a knee-jerk reaction, and will argue against regulation for two reasons. First of all, they worry it will affect their profits. And second, almost philosophically, that in some areas there is a belief in the self-organization of the market that amounts almost to a religion. So I believe in markets. I believe that markets are really important, but markets don't self-organize. They're human creations, and we can shape markets that they produce not only the private goods, but also public benefits as well. So I would hope that a company such as Nestlé, which I think is one of the ones that's on the front foot, will engage with governments to encourage governments to set up frameworks within which it's easier for them to operate. And I hope that governments are braver in setting those rules.
Oh, thank you. This is really good advice that we're going to take forward, hopefully. So thank you so much, Charles, for these wonderful insights. And this is all we have time for today. So stay tuned to the next episode of the Power of Food podcast. Bye for now.
Thank you very much.